Hello, this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech, and I'm going to be going over the deck that I used to win the recent Game Day competition out at Card Kingdom. It is a blue, red, white tempo deck. Now, the goal of this deck is twofold. It's either to reduce your opponent's life to 0 in the early game, or to stabilize against the super aggressive decks and win with your better 3-drops. So this deck really sits in that mid-range category, although it's hyper-aggressive for a mid-range deck. It will not win the super long games, and it's not going to blow you out on turn 3 or turn 4. So you need to figure out against each of your opponents where your game exists. Are you stabilizing or are you crushing them? Now, a lot of people refer to this as a control deck. This is very different from a lot of the lists that you'll see online that Gary Thompson or Todd Anderson or others have been pushing the last few months. This is a much, much more aggressive version of the deck. One of the big things you're going to notice here is that it's got 4 Geist of St. Traft main deck. It also has Turn and Burn and Pillar of Flame main deck. These are direct damage spells. They can be used against your opponent. They're also 2 of the best spells to remove your opponent's blockers from the game. So this is a highly aggressive list. We're going to look at some of the ways that this differs from conventional wisdom and talk about what cards worked and what cards I might actually look at changing if I was going to be playing in the Pro Tour qualifier this weekend. The 2 biggest all-stars in this deck are clearly Geist of St. Traft and Snapcaster Mage. I am shocked that these guys aren't seeing more play in Standard. Geist is just incredible. It's a winning card in Modern, and it's also a winning card in Legacy. Take advantage of the short time that's left for this card to be in Standard and blow people out with it. Now, Snapcaster Mage, I understand that the more cards you have access to, like Swords to Plowshares and Brainstorms, the better Snapcaster gets. But there are some really key cards at the 1 and 2 casting costs currently in Standard that are great given what other people are playing. And that's why I'm playing Snapcaster Mages right now. This has a heavy burn package to it. There's 3 Pillar of Flames main deck. That's because of Voice of Resurgence. Voice of Resurgence is a monster, and Pillar of Flame is the best way to take it out. It also significantly improves your matchup against all of the aggro decks, because you're able to Pillar on turn 1, on turn 2, put out something like a Blind Obedience. Yes, I have Blind Obedience in this deck. And then on turn 3, you're able to use a Snapcaster and Pillar something else. Also, the amount of burn in here is very large. The turn and burn, in lots of situations, you end up burning out your opponent's blockers or even burning to your opponent's face for that last few points of damage. Having a high amount of burn in this deck and a low amount of control, which I'm going to cover a little bit later, is extremely important for the tempo aggro feel of this deck. The big new tech that's in here, and I got this from BBD. He wrote an article a few weeks ago over this deck, and it's Blind Obedience. Blind Obedience blanks a lot of 4 casting cost cards currently played in the environment. Hell Riders are so much worse when they come into play tapped. Falkenrath Aristocrats are junk when they come into play tapped. And Advent of the Worm loses a lot of its surprise value coming into play tapped. Now, Blind Obedience is only so-so in a control strategy. It buys you a few life, it lets you stabilize, but when you're the aggro deck, it is amazing. Blind Obedience on turn 2, followed by a Geist of St. Traft, gives you an incredibly powerful, fast clock. It also turns your burn spells into extra power. Pillar of Flame starts to look a lot more like a lightning bolt. Boros Charm deals 5 damage to the face. Snapcaster Mage even does an extra damage. And when you hit that 5 mana, Snapcaster Mage, paying an extra mana, then Pillar of Flame, paying an extra mana, you're doing a lot of damage to close out the game. Another thing that I really love in here is Turn and Burn. This card is incredible, and it's much better on the offense than on the defense. Defensively, you don't want to turn your opponent's Voice of Resurgence into a 0/1 on their turn, because they're going to get a token out of it. But on the offense, you definitely want to turn it into a 0/1 when you're attacking with a Geist. Burn is also incredible. The amount of damage that you have in this deck is very high. I also really want to point out that this card deals extremely well with indestructible creatures, at least those under the current rules that have indestructibility as a creature ability, because turn removes that. And after we see the fourth M14 rule changes, it will also deal with those from things like Boros Charm. This is a great utility card. I never felt bad about having it, and it's one that I would consider upping in the main deck count. Now, I also have a high number of singletons in this deck. This is one of the things that makes decks that I play more difficult to play against, especially when you have Thought Scour, so you can fill a lot of options into your graveyard pretty quickly. All of these cards are in the main deck. Unsummon won me at least 2 games, and Dispel caused a blowout of one of my opponents. Having this variety of cards to deal with lots of situations helps a lot. And when you're looking at a tempo strategy where you're trying to keep your opponent off guard, having a diversified threat portfolio is extremely important. This is very different than playing a combo deck where you're just trying to assemble your 2 or 3 pieces as quick as possible. With a tempo deck, you're trying to keep them off balance and hit them hard and keep them guessing. And having singletons that are powerful and have the potential to swing the game is very useful. Now, one of the big things that I've changed compared to other decks is that I've went for burn over counter magic. I've only got one Dispel main deck, although that Dispel definitely has the ability to blow out a Sphinx's Revelation or an Advent of the Worm when they're not expecting it. But the real counter magic is in the sideboard, and it's only brought in when dealing with particular decks where you have to counter a Sphinx's Revelation or you have to counter a specific spell. This is an aggressive tempo deck, not a slow controlling deck. There's no Sphinx's Revelation in this deck. Yes, you heard me correctly. There's no Sphinx's Revelation. The idea is to eliminate your opponent, not to draw massive card advantage. So even though I'm running 24-25 land, that land is being used with the extra mana going into Extort on the Blind Obedience. You got minor life gain, but the damage you're doing to your opponent is extremely important. Your good matchups are those matchups where your Pillar of Flame gets reused again and again, or where you're able to use something like a Boros Charm to protect your team. You usually only have 1 to 2 creatures out. Something like Supreme Verdict is actually not that good against you. The ability to recover quickly with a Slayers Stronghold helps you deal with those board wipes. Your rough matchups, though, are honestly Lingering Souls and Sacrifice type effects, far and away being one of the best ones in the environment. If you're going to see a lot of Lingering Souls out there, I'll talk about how to deal with that. One of the options, though, for getting around Lingering Souls is to send your direct damage at your opponent's face, and remember, the Blind Obedience is going to bring those tokens into play tapped. So if you've got the fast strategy going on and you've identified that you're on the aggro track, sometimes even Lingering Souls is too slow to slow you down. Now, the sideboard here really takes some of your bad matchups and makes them much better by giving you some flexibility. If you're going against the really fast aggro decks, you drop the high things in your curve and you put in the Pillars of Flame, the Searing Spears, and make sure that you stabilize as soon as possible. If you're going up against those control decks where the burn doesn't matter that much, you add some really powerful control, and your hope is to drop 1 creature or be able to even add a flash creature at the end of the turn, and then control the board state. Counterflux is a great counter spell. Dissipate also works extremely well. I also really like Skullcrack when dealing with the life gain decks. Normally, I wouldn't put Skullcrack in a control red, white, blue deck, but it's wonderful in the tempo deck because often people think that they made it to Thragtusk, they're going to win, and you're able to blow them out by Skullcracking when the Thragtusk hits and then swinging through with your Geist to finish them off with an Angel. Nevermore is also one that people usually don't expect out of this deck and works really well against some of the Reanimator strategies. It also works well against the control decks that rely on board sweepers. This deck worked extremely well for me at game day, went 8-0, 16-2 for games. The power really comes in, though, in the Geist and the Snapcaster Mage, especially when you're able to control the game. Now, if I was going to play this tomorrow in a PTQ, I'd probably up the amount of Thundermaw Hellkites. As you saw in the deck list, I was only running one. Aristocrats is very popular right now, and Thundermaw is a wonderful answer to huge numbers of flyers and lingering souls. I also really like Turn and Burn and Azorius Charm when you are on the offense. It deals with Voice of Resurgence extremely well. Highly recommend adding more to the main deck, maybe cutting down a little bit of the other burn in favor of Turn and Burn and Azorius Charm. Gotta show off a quick picture of the playmat. Very, very happy with the game here. Thanks. This has been Brian Rowe of Mythic MTG Tech, looking at a red, blue, white tempo deck that I strongly recommend checking out if you're looking to play in the upcoming Pro Tour qualifiers.